emphasize, yeah, Nettie boy, raise your hand. Cash, no hiding now. This is the time, this is a community moment. If you had 365 dinners with me and begged me not to talk about the book even one time, please raise your hand. Thank you. This is my family. I want to thank Kelly, Megan, Nick, Marty. These are my deep family, and they would say, could we not talk about this? But if you only wanted to write one book, the only book I want to write, I wanted a practical book that would help people based on real people's lessons, and then answers to common questions from the smartest people in America. That's this book. So, do I really have to take these meds forever? People have asked me that a million times. I live with bipolar disorder. I take these meds forever? Who the heck cares what I think? I sucked at science, and I couldn't do calculus. But Andy Nierenberg, who's the king of bipolar disorder for planet Earth, gives a compassionate and beautiful answer. Why shouldn't that be easy to find? So I would come to the bookstore, and I'd see 100 memoirs and 100 textbooks. Now, we all know nobody reads textbooks, so those are done. And memoirs are cool, but they're not practical unless you're in that person's exact experience. And so I was interested in a synthesis of the first-person experience plus answers by really smart researchers. This is the both-and approach that the book represents. The National Alliance on Mental Illness never had a book. I had never written a book. I had paid multiple parking tickets over many years here at Brookline, waiting for this book, and I finally just broke down and said, I'm going to try to write this book. So that's the story. Jordan and I sat through 150, Jordan, raise your hand, 150 hours of interviews with people all over the country. The pandemic was catastrophic for many people and had many negative consequences. One of the things it gave us is that mental health became a we problem, not a they problem. And I did recognize that this was the moment that if I was going to write like my new insights on the history of World War II, or the one book that I always wanted to see, this was the moment. The National Alliance on Mental Illness is the largest group of mental health people with lived experience and families in the world, and they never had a book. And 5 years ago, I said, hey guys, how about we had a book? No, we don't need a book. 10 years ago, should we have a book? I think it'd be pretty cool. We don't want a book. Then I got a new CEO. This is a game of persistence. Third CEO I asked, I said, Dan, we need to write this book. And he said, go. One word. So if you're ever running something, if you're the CEO of something, and somebody pitches an idea to you, consider the possibility of saying yes. So all the royalties from all the sales of this book go to NAMI. This is a love gift from all of us to all the people who feel isolated and alone with mental health conditions, as my family did, feel shame and isolation as my family did. So it's a beautiful thing to be at Brookline Booksmith. It's kind of surreal. I can't believe it's not a baseball book or a history book, but my life went in a different direction. And I'm so grateful for that, because at the core, even though I trained in psychiatry and Kesh taught me a lot at Harvard and all those good things, at the core, I'm still a person who thinks about it as a family member. At the core, that's still who I am. And I was always like looking for a book that would speak to us. That's this book. So there's 130 people, 38 different states, 11 self-identified races and ethnicities, ages 16 to 100. One woman said she was old as dirt. That could be over 100, could be under 100. It's indeterminate, I think, was what the scientists would say, Kesh. Indeterminate, right? And it was a great privilege to talk to people. So you're going to meet 3 people everywhere I go across the country on this 25 city book tour with Jordan. We're going to be interviewing people from that city. So in Denver, it's different people. In Los Angeles, it's different people. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, it's different people. Last night in New York City, it was 4 completely different people. The idea is the stories have value. If you look at all 130 of them, hopefully I've organized them, with Jordan's help, in some coherent way. And hopefully they're readable in a way that you can follow the entire journey. So I want to just thank everybody in this room, because this is my little bookstore. I can't believe this is the first little book event. All of you have helped in your own way, and I'm very grateful to you. So I want to start by telling you the 3 of the people of the 130 I met in the book. And I'm going to tell you how I found each of them, and then I'm going to let them explain why they wanted to be in this book, where you have to use your name. And say to people, you sure you want to use your name? Once you think about it, talk to your family, get back to me in a week. Because it's a radical act. People don't do this. in the acknowledgments of all the mental health books you have. My patients are my greatest teachers. They're all private. I hide their anonymity. I'm fine with keeping them private. That's great. But if they're not your patients, there's a whole untapped set of wisdom that we have missed out on as a field. I really believe this is like this huge gap, and this book's going to fill it, and you're going to learn why. First person we're going to hear from is Sukhmani Ball. I taught that course at the Harvard School of Public Health where Eliza would come and knock the students' socks off, and I'd say, yeah, after the 10th year, I'm like, maybe there's something here for this book. Like, it took me the first 5 years. I was like, well, that was a great session, Eliza. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's something here. Sukhmani was the best student I ever had in teaching 20 years of the BU School of Public Health. Wow. One of the things she told me is that she wanted to change the culture that she lived in. We've become friends over time, and she's going to tell you a little bit about her experience. Oh, you have your own mic, yay.
Thanks. In the spirit of honesty, I'm very nervous. This is my first in-person event in 3 years, and it's weird to not be wearing sweatpants. Normally my cat's off in the corner. But my name is Sukhmani, and I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2014 following the school shooting at UCSB. I was a student there, and the shooting actually triggered my first manic episode. And I remember being in the library after I was diagnosed and just frantically searching for someone that looked like me or had a name like mine that had been through what I had been through. And I felt so strongly that if I could just find someone like me that had been through this, that had made it, then I could do it. And when I found no one, I thought, maybe this is it, maybe I just die. And I have had a catastrophic course of illness in terms of bipolar disorder. It's been 8 hospitalizations, multiple suicide attempts, and I realized that this was, a problem in our community that no one was talking about. In my family, we had struggled with mental health issues and addiction issues for generations, and no one had really talked about it. And the same was happening for me. So I was a student in neuroscience, and I found that my biological understanding of the illness, as well as my lived experience, made for a good talk. And I started giving talks, and I've been doing that for about 8 years. And when I started, my family wanted nothing to do with them. They didn't want to hear about them. They didn't want to know that they existed. They just didn't want me doing them because it was a huge blight on our family that I was so open about having bipolar disorder. And it didn't matter that I had been invited to speak at Harvard alongside Ken, which I think is actually the first place where we met. But it was this weird dichotomy of I lived this life where I was a public speaker and people would come up to me after events and we'd have these amazing heart-to-heart moments, but I couldn't talk about it on Facebook or Instagram where the family was. And I wrote a talk called Illness and Identity, Growing Up Brown and Bipolar, that I pitched to NAMI, and it was accepted for their convention. And I called my mom and I was like, Mom, this is really big. I think I'm gonna be the first South Asian speaker to do a lived experience piece there. And I wanna share this. And she finally relented and was okay. So I made this post that it must have taken me a couple of weeks to get it out. And some of you remember it, which is actually really great. Thank you for being here. Darian actually took the photo for it, but it was chronicling the fact that I had given these talks, that I was going to give this talk, this was my memoir, and I was going to share it, and that I invited members of my community to join me. And I was terrified, and I thought people are going to think oh, this crazy person is now spouting crazy nonsense. And the response to the post was actually breathtaking. And I still want to cry when I think about how many people reached out to me after that post, how many friends and family, ex-boyfriends, teachers, people that I hadn't spoken to in over a decade wanted to share their stories with me and wanted to come to this event. And since then, things have changed. Like, I post a lot more about my mental health online, and my family as a whole, like including my extended family, now talks about mental health a lot more. We have a lot of people in our family who are diagnosed bipolar, and they've, like shared their experiences with me, and there's been this kind of overwhelming feeling, well, like if Sukhmani could do it, then I can do it too. And I think back to that 21-year-old that was in the library alone, thinking that was the end, and having no books with no representation and no, like, nothing that said that, like, it's okay and you'll make it. And now that book exists, and I think that's a huge gift that Ken has given me to be part of this project, and that's why I wanted to use my name. I use my full name, Sukhmani Kaur Bal, because most names in the book, when you look at them, you can't necessarily discern ethnicity, but my name, when you look at it, is very clearly like, oh, that's a girl from Punjab. And now there exists a space that I hope will build on future conversations in the South Asian community around mental health. But that's what I wanted to share. And
Best student of all time. 20 years, 20 students, 400 students, pretty good. So, all right, so you get gray hair, you run into people. You get to know people over time, and I've had a lot of different jobs. And one of them is I volunteered at the PrEP, Prevention Recovery of Early Psychosis program in Jamaica Plain. This is a transformative model where you don't have to get relegated to coming to community mental health, being given a depot shot, and being seen 4 times a year. It's a community of young people, the families are engaged and involved. People are trying to figure out how to keep relationships, what do you disclose, what don't you disclose. It was like fantastic 5 years. And I got to work with Dr. Cynthia Berkowitz there, who was like the real doc. I was the volunteer. I turned up on Thursday afternoons. I saw a few people. It was really cool because I got to feel this innovation. This is an innovation that was developed in Australia about 12 years ago, and now it's in 300 programs across America, thanks in large measure to NAMI and advocacy and fighting for something like this. So Cynthia and I are complaining about how the PrEP program is going. No one's ever complained about their job to a colleague, I'm sure, but we were having that experience. And I said, it's so bad, I'm gonna leave Blue Cross because I got a book deal and I'm gonna write this book and I'm gonna talk to real people. And Cynthia said, the coolest thing, I think I need to be in your book. And so Cynthia, with her sister, which she'll be doing a webinar tomorrow, taught me a lot about the sibling relationship and how families manage sibling relationships. So Cynthia, I want to thank you for being in the book, being here.
So I'm the one who should say thank you because PrEP, we had a wonderful time at PrEP. I never, ever complained.
I complained and you listened.
No, PrEP was a wonderful place where I was privileged to be medical director, and Ken was, we learned a lot from him consulting to us. And, when he told me about this, I invited myself, and he accepted my invitation. Thank you so much. And the reason I invited myself was because it was so important to talk about siblings. There's a basic message. Remember the sibling. So when I was 18 years old, my older sister, she's 3 years older than myself, when she had been in college, really bright and capable and poised, she came home and she was floridly manic. And I can't find words to tell you how profound the impact of that was on my whole life. Every major decision that came after that was so deeply shaped by that experience. And so when I say remember the sibling to families, there's a few reasons for that. The first is just the very painful emotions. So maybe you were not expecting a teenager to feel crushed with guilt, a sense of responsibility about the decisions that her parents make in a medical crisis. But if you're not thinking about that, please loosen the leash on your imagination, because it happens. And of course, that guilt, that sense of responsibility gives birth to a lot of anger, and there's grief and fear. It can be very, very painful, and those feelings in a sibling need help. The second point is that when parents are dealing with a crisis like this, it's natural that it really can occupy a lot of their bandwidth. And that's important for families to recognize and to talk about, and to pull in other resources to help. Although we didn't talk about that problem, in fact it was denied. My father once said, you know, Cynthia, the thing that's so wonderful about you is you're just so easy. And but I had an aunt and uncle who were extremely helpful to me. When I was troubled, I'd call them and they could listen at length. But the other issue about siblings is that they carry risk for developing these illnesses, and it's so important to talk to them about how you manage the risk. I have a son in the back, and he can tell you a lot about how to reduce the risk of psychosis, because we talk about this. And of course, the other thing to be said is that illnesses happen, okay, and if it happens, we will deal with it, to bring it into the light of day, and to talk about something that's a part of life. I was allowed 2 lessons. The other important lesson is say no to stigma. So when I was that teenager, this problem was a deep, dark secret. None of even my closest friends could not know about this. And it was only when I began as a professional to be working in programs related to early psychosis. The first time was in medical school, when I was on a research project studying multifamily psychoeducational psychotherapy, that I told a group of families that my sister had mental illness. It's such a pleasure to do this, because the families just love it. You? It's really fun. I love it. So, and this book really is a major step in that joyful process of going from the shadows out into the light of day. It's just the antidote to stigma, to be able to be in the book and to have my name in it, and to have the whole world know, and to be able to talk about it. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
I'll just say, I got to know Cynthia and her sister Janet so well over the course of multiple conversations, and I could see their friendship deepening, like in real time. Like they were in a process of working together. Janet's been quite vulnerable, quite ill, multiple complexities, and is now a peer person in New Jersey.
And I'm very proud of her.
And she's,
40 years really makes a difference.
And one of Cynthia's quotes is, our relationship is like fine wine. It just took some time, I think, is one of the quotes that we were able to keep in the book. There's so many great quotes. So thank you, Cynthia. So all these folks are ready to take your questions. So Nancy-Lee Mauger was a great addition to the book. And again, you find people in different ways. But about 10 years ago, Nancy-Lee, this thing called the Metoo Orchestra is developed. And the Metoo Orchestra are classical musicians living with mental health conditions, or the people who love them. Starts in Vermont, comes to Boston. There's another one in Manchester, New Hampshire, one purportedly in Denmark. I did a little session with them at a NAMI webinar. And I said to Carolyn and Ronald, would you be willing to send out an email to people in your community? They're writing this book, people have to use their names, you should really think about it, because, once you make 50,000 of them, they're not going back. And they said, oh, you should talk to Nancy-Lee Mauger. And Nancy-Lee volunteered to be in the book, and I'm incredibly grateful, because her lessons are still different than Sukhmani's and Cynthia's. So I just want to say thank you, Nancy-Lee. Oh, you have your own microphone.
Hi. The most exciting thing for me is the title of this book, You Are Not Alone, because when you're given a diagnosis of a mental illness, you feel the shame and you don't want to talk about it. I was diagnosed correctly after many years of being in the system with multiple personality dissociative identity disorder. And when you tell somebody, they're like, they don't know what DID is, and you say multiple personality, then all of the TV shows and the movies come out and people think something about you already. There's a huge group of women that I know that won't even tell their family members, they won't tell their friends that they have it because of the shame. And it's a real problem. So in the Metoo Orchestra, we play a movement of a piece, and then somebody in the orchestra can get up and speak and share their story. And I've taken that advantage every time that they give it to me, because it's so important to just say, I'm a horn player. Actually, I quit horn playing at one point because parts of me were taking over that didn't know how to play the horn in a real paid gig, and that was kind of devastating. But through work, I really was able to pull it together to actually just say, this is what it looks like. Yes, I have moments in time when I'm really a mess and a part of me is overtaken and I am a child or confused or angry, but that's not who I am in my core. And internal family systems therapy has saved my life. I've been in IFS for 12 years now. I got an IFS therapist as soon as I was diagnosed. And to learn that everybody is built in multiplicity, which is not the norm. For people who have DID, they think that we are special in that. We are parts and everyone else is a singular person, and that just doesn't fly with me. And I try to, it just makes it so much easier to say, when my therapist says to me, a part of me feels this, I say, what? What do you mean? You have a part too? And it took me a really long time to be okay with that, but it was so, he wasn't, just trying to be like me. He was me. And to come at therapy and that, he's not perfect. And when we have had a few points in time where we really butted heads, and he had to step back and I had to step back, and this part of me was triggered by something he said, and I get to learn about how to be in the world with these parts of me like everyone needs to do, right? I think the world would be a better place if we all kind of took IFS, took a look at it, and just learned that you have a perfect self inside of you that can lead you. And it's courage, creativity, connectiveness, all of those 8 C's that they talk about just is life-changing. So I'm here to just say I have DID and it's okay. And I didn't get hired for a babysitting job once. The people that I was, and I've been babysitting for 30 years, and I have 2 children of my own, and I told them in the first 5 minutes of the interview that I had this, and they said, well, we Googled you, and we were wondering what you were going to say. And I just said, yeah, it's the truth, and I take really great care of children because that's really important to me, because some of that happened to me, and it wasn't great. So I just want people to know that it's a way to be, and there's nothing to be afraid of, and we need to stop Hollywood from making any more of these ridiculous movies, and it's just so upsetting when a new one comes out. So this is what it looks like. Thank you so much, and thank you.
All right, well, we have a nice opportunity for conversations for any of the panelists, or for asking me if you secretly want to write a book. What was it like? Or you work for a nonprofit, you think they should write a book? We could take up any topic related to this.
I wanted to suggest I could take a microphone so that the crowd is audible on the live stream and to you folks.
Okay.
If 2 of you wouldn't mind sharing.
Sure.
And I will.
Which one should we do? One of the middle ones?
Sure.
All right, great. Thanks, Bonnie.
Right, and you call on
Don't everyone speak at once.
Thank you, Zhuzha. See, this is like a family event. I know I know all these staff of the people here. It's really fun.
What is one thing you would like to see changed as an outcome of this book being read and becoming a bestseller and people becoming more aware?
Just an easy one. I'd like to see people have courage with their mental health issues and not be ashamed.
I think something this book does really well is that it's not necessarily focused on depression and anxiety, which I think the bulk of the stuff that we consume around mental health is, and it kind of normalizes the conversation around bipolar disorder and more serious mental illnesses. And I'd like people to have more candid conversations about things like that and DID. And that's what I hope the book gives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a balm to Stigma. It's a wonderful innovation, and I hope that it spurs more people to really come forth and speak about mental illness the way you talk about your heart disease and your pneumonia.
Yeah, so the book isn't about one diagnosis. I want to pick up on this thread. We talked to 130 people. We did a panel today earlier with a woman who got addicted to OxyContin, and she lost 100 people in her contacts and her phone to overdose deaths, right? And that's just a person I met at one of my other jobs. And I said I was leaving and I was writing a book and telling real people's stories. She said, oh, I got to tell my story. People need to know what happened to me. I had social anxiety as a 13-year-old girl, and alcohol was harder to get than opiates.
Yeah.
So of course, NAMI started with moms being blamed by psychiatrists for their children's schizophrenia. That's kind of the OG original story. And I interviewed a 100-year-old woman who was at the first convention. She has since passed. So this book is 2% the history of the movement that is NAMI, but it's not diagnostic in any way. I think most of these issues transcend diagnosis. People who live with OCD live with a lot of the same shame that people who live with schizophrenia live with. People who become severely depressed have overlaps. Like, it's a lot of spectrum strategy. So the book isn't organized. The easiest book to write is by diagnosis. I interviewed 5 people with anxiety disorders. And that's not actually the book I wanted to write at all. There's thematic phenomena. If you're in the addiction space and you're told to throw out your lithium, it's not very helpful if you also live with bipolar disorder. And I talked to people who had that exact problem. So that's, to me, the thematic concern, right? That was kind of why the book covers the waterfront. Ridiculously ambitious book, right? But it doesn't purport to explain everything. It explains to teach you some thematic things. Ned.
First of all, I just have to congratulate all of you, including the man to your far left, right? And I just feel so thrilled as a mental health professional myself, the bravery that you've shown and the pioneering spirit that Ken led you with. The whole world is going to become a dramatically better place because of this book. And I just can't thank you enough and congratulate you enough. But I did have a specific question. I forgot, I don't do names. I've got absent name disorder. The lady sitting next to Ken.
Nancy-Lee.
Nancy. I wanted to ask you, what in fact, I've never had a patient who had DID, at least that I'm aware of. What is the difference between what we see in the Hollywood movies and the actual condition?
Well, I don't turn into a dog. The United States of Tara, she had I don't change my outfit every day. I am a human being who has, so I've been having this debate with myself about DID being an actual thing. So if we're all built in multiplicity, I think we're all in a spectrum. And when I was learning about my trauma as a child, so I'm in the world today and I'm walking down the street and I see a house that's a certain color. A part of me gets a feeling and a memory shoots up. And if I'm not aware of that happening, then I'm dissociated and I become that part. And I'm no longer able to really control what's going on. That happened a lot in the first 5 years of my diagnosis. When I told my 2 grown children that I had DID, they're like, of course you do. And now we can talk about it and make sense of the things that happened in their lives. And it's not, you're not gonna see somebody walking down the street and I don't switch. I went to McLean Hospital when I was first diagnosed and a nurse came up to me, a nurse on the ward, and she said, locked unit, she said, you don't have DID, I don't see you switch. And I felt like I had to be a circus actor, and that's not what it's about. It's really literally driving down the road and then starting to cry and not understanding it, playing my horn and literally not being able to read music. That was like, I thought I was having a stroke. Mm-hmm. And it was a little part of me that was very excited and wanted to try to play my horn. So now I do all of this prep and I walk in and I say, nobody can play but the horn player. And it's, I like to think of it not as a disorder, but that I need to put my parts in order. And that's really all, we all have these parts of us. And I don't think that, I think it's a amiss that they're calling it a disorder, because it's just getting your trauma, getting to know all of those parts of you, and then moving on and preparing as you go out into the world. Thank you, it's a great question.
Megan, my oldest daughter. She can always be counted on.
Had to show up for this. Thank you all so much for your bravery in telling your story. I wish it wasn't something that you had to be brave for, and I know that that's what you're working for here. I'm trained to be a physician, and I want to ask, from all of your perspectives, what is a moment that I and other people in healthcare, other people who interact with anyone really, can learn a lesson about ways to treat people who are going through this kind of suffering?
I'll jump in. So I have a lot of issues with a dentist, and I would have a dentist and he would just say, I'm gonna take a picture, and then he would stuff something in my mouth and I would lose it. I think the most important thing is to let us come to speak to students and tell them what they should look for.
Right.
But also, when you're approaching a patient for the first time, what makes you uncomfortable? You know, is there something that you want to tell me about yourself that I need to know? Don't come at me from behind, you know, simple things that you don't have time for, right?
Right.
But even maybe having a little questionnaire in the beginning, the more that we speak out, people are going to be more willing to tell their side of what makes them uncomfortable. So I think that would be helpful.
So, when you encounter as a physician people who are going through a crisis, they can feel deeply troubled, and sometimes you find, you know, behind the closed doors, the clinicians are talking to each other and maybe commenting about a person's dynamics and their thoughts about being critical of people about how they're coping with the situation. And it's always important to, there's a classic story that people used to tell back in the bad old days of the schizophrenic mother, that the mother would go to see her son who has schizophrenia in the hospital, and when he wanted to hug her, she would freeze up, she would tighten up and couldn't hug him. Well, when you don't know anything about psychosis and you have a loved one who has psychosis, maybe it's hard to hug them. And it's important to remember that all the people you're seeing, person with the illness, the people around them, that they're in a crisis, and their personality function, the way that they cope, the way that they interact is changed by that crisis. And it doesn't tell you so much about what they would do in the absence of that crisis.
I have a couple things on this. You would never do this, Megan, and nor the other docs in the room. I could easily have done a chapter on terrible pronouncements about your future. I limited to about 3 because I didn't want to beat up on doctors who routinely are saving people's lives in the book. All just first. I wanted to not make this. You could have done a chapter on you're never going to get better. You can't recover. You're going to need a custodian. Literally, people were told that. We just, Jordan and I are nodding. I hired a bunch of students from the Yale University to do qualitative analysis, just to keep track of all the Zoom calls. One of the biggest categories was negative pronouncements by caregivers, because that stays with people. Even if only one person says it one time, here you arrive with vulnerability and somebody says, you're never going to get better. I do want to say there's hope, Nancy-Lee. Des Moines University on our tour in beautiful Des Moines, Iowa, has a program called NAMI Provider, where people with lived experience and families talk to medical students. And that's the largest medical students that creates primary care doctors in America. University of Iowa is doing the same thing. Now, it's one dinky state in cornland. I mean, it's in the middle. But, you know, we don't have it at Harvard. We don't have it at Tufts. So it's in the book, though. And the idea is we've got to get the book into more places so more people can learn. These are really basic things. Anything I need to know about you? I know you don't have enough time, but that's a pretty quick thing to say, right? And you don't get 2 minutes to answer. You have to answer more quickly. So it's still some time pressure, but I think there is some hope in this regard.
I think just to add to that, there's like a level of loving that goes into medicine, and I think that you have to love all of your patients to some degree to really treat them. And I think a lot about my PCP, who I'm a writer, and she will read anything that I send to her. And she came to my NAMI talk, and she is actively interested in who I am as a person outside of my illness. And that relationship that I have with her, I think, is one of the most important in my life.
She taking patients.
Question was, is she taking patients, right? It's a fabulous person.
This is such a great question. Can I add one more thing, which is that a lot of medical education is about an episode of an illness and how to deal with that one immediate crisis. But so much of what you see in mental health professions, in other medical specialties, is about chronic illness. And a lot of what our task has to be focused on and our training needs to be more focused on is how to help people remodel their lives. The founder of PrEP, Susanna Zimmett, has a phrase, remodeling hopes and dreams. Because people have great futures when they develop a medical problem, but it takes a village, it takes a whole, it just takes such a concerted effort to help people on that slow track to getting back on their feet. And the news, especially in mental illness, is so much better these days. There's so much innovation.
Seth, you had your hand up.
Couple of things. Hi, I'm Seth Bell. I met Ken when I was a first year psychiatry resident in '95. He was the medical director at Mass Mental, just to put myself in context. But the person who said that you have to love your patients to be a good doctor, that is profoundly true. Because if you take medicine and you subtract love, you're basically doing biochemistry in a lab. And nobody wants to be treated like an Erlenmeyer class. And people don't get better if they're treated like an Erlenmeyer class. So I wanted to thank you for saying that. And in connection with that, I wanted to say that one of the most favorite quotes in all of medicine that I associate with Dr. Duckworth, Ken Duckworth, is that there's a 19th century physician that most people here have probably heard of, named Sir William Foster. And one of the things he said that has always stuck with me is that it is just as important to understand the person who has the disease as it is to understand what disease the person has. And I just want to take this opportunity to recognize Ken as a physician who has always lived that, who always taught that. And many, many fine physicians have emerged because of that teaching. Thank you.
No question, Seth? All you have is a nice compliment, that's all you got, really? Yeah. All right.
All right.
Ken, why the blue blazer?
Seth, attire, hair, makeup, I suck at these things.
All right.
And so I've been on CBS Good Morning 4 times. You know, I was on yesterday to announce the release of the book. I've made friends with hair and makeup. And I walk in and I say, "Hi, Sue, do you have anything in a 40-year-old thin and limber man?" And they remember that joke from the last time and the time before and the time before. But basically, this is never something I've figured out. So this is the standard uniform. I put on the standard uniform, I hope for the best. Good question, Seth. Piercing insight. Piercing. All right, a couple more questions before we call it, I think. Bonnie wants to make sure, she told me that not to go much over 8. Well, we're doing okay?
We started a little late. So
All
it's
right.
okay if we go
Okay, we
over.
did start a little late, actually.
So, yeah. Do we
Yeah, go ahead.
here?
Hi. Can you talk a little bit about, nature and nurture? Like, I'm thinking of like Hidden Valley Road and the divergence of the National Institute of Mental Health and and how they've gone in different directions with the DSM and all of that.
Yes, I'll take that one. So in the back of the book, I have the 3 smartest people from the National Institute of Mental Health answer these questions. Why should I participate in research? That's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. What is neurostimulation? This is transcranial magnetic stimulation and its related phenomena. And how do we get better drugs? Our drugs suck. It's not the question. I upgraded a little. All the drugs have side effects. All of them are problematic. Why can't we do better? The research domain criteria is the idea that DSM is all descriptive phenomena. You describe symptoms and they put it into categories, and then a psychologist in Ann Arbor and a social worker on Cape Cod would add up the same symptoms and came up with the same diagnosis. There's no underlying biological pin to it at all. None. It's extremely humbling. One of the stories I tell in the group, after my brother died, I had something which in the 80s would have been called grief. Then they had a depression exclusion for grief. Like you got the first 2 months of severe grief off. You couldn't have depression. So I lost my sister 10 years ago. I was very close to my siblings, and I was basically devastated. I was really not functioning very well. I would call into meetings and then stop functioning. I'd say my name and then stop paying attention. And you can run with that for months if you've been a good employee. Then they came out, since I put the book together, with prolonged grief disorder. What are they doing? They're trying to put a framework on human experience, right? It's not that easy to do. So in the 80s, I would have had depression. In the 90s, I would have had grief, right? Because the occlusion was removed. And, like, what? None of that is rooted in biology. None of that is based in any science, really, other than people who are really struggling after a year now can have a mental illness, as defined by the DSM. Is that good for disability? It might have an advantage or two, but I think it's hard to know because a committee of people educated in the same subculture decided that that was a new diagnosis. The research domain criteria, I'm sorry to report, is not even close to ready for prime time. But the NIMH puts millions of dollars into the idea, is there like a fear processing index? Is there a way that people experience novelty? So it's all kind of brain science based. Josh Gordon, the director of the NIMH, has become a friend of mine, and he says, just not ready. So the descriptive phenomena that we have that have zero biological underpinnings. Now, Kesh is working on it. We're waiting for your papers, Kesh, right? He's working on biological underpinnings for different kinds of schizophrenia, right? Like, that's something Kesh is working on. We don't have that yet. So we can't predict who will respond to clozapine, which is the best antipsychotic. We can't predict that. We have no biological metrics at all. We put half people on it, half the people get better and half don't. And it's very humbling. So this field has some of the shame, negative social attitudes, in part because how hard the brain is. I think the brain is so much harder than the plumbing of cardiology. And frankly, cardiologists drive better cars. So we as a society have decided to value cardiology at a higher level. Nobody pays private cardiologists. Have you ever heard of a radiologist who doesn't accept insurance? It's unimaginable. So somehow the fact that there's mysteries in the brain, and we're afraid that we could enter this club, which I of course entered at that time, some of the time, depending on when you looked, we decided to underpay people. And I talk about that in the book as well, right? That's a version of how society has agreed that these aren't legitimate human phenomena. And that in part is based on how hard the brain is and how primitive the descriptive system is. There is a real thing called bipolar disorder. I saw it at age 8, and I've taken care of thousands of people with it. But what are the edges of it? Is it schizoaffective disorder? They list it between depression and schizophrenia in the DSM as the bridge phenomenon. Is it? I mean, is it? So the answer is we don't know. And I think it's really honest to be, we don't know, is the true answer. And then there's all these amazing people who've actually learned something that you could learn when you just accept that the diagnostic framework is so imperfect, you have to just accept that. It's a long answer. Anybody want to add to that? All right. Cash, do you want to tell us about your paper?
No.
So, Troy Keshavan is my academic chair, and he has been a champion throughout the book and has been incredibly supportive, because the book is a little counterculture in the psychiatry world, right? I just want to emphasize that. He's been incredibly kind to me and supportive, and I want to thank you. And he does this research on your question.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. And I also want to echo a number of other people who have said how much this book reflects you as a role model. as a person, as a doctor. And I have seen that in person. I just want to say that working with you and Cynthia in prep in all those years, and we all complained, but also really enjoyed. And I also want to comment on what you brought up, which is a very important thing, and that is the importance of a brain-based language in how we think about the labels that we use when we define mental disorders, and how we think about treatments for these disorders. And in many ways, you alluded to the possibility that, and the fact that psychiatry itself is stigmatized. Compared to cardiology or radiology, where we are talking about objective things that cannot be blamed, like the heart or the lungs and so on. We are blaming people's behaviors and using these labels. And our hope collectively in the field is to move towards a time when we will not be using adjectives to make our diagnosis, but to describe the phenomena in neurobiological terms, for example. So the one question I have in relation to that is that there has been so much of a paradigm shift happening in psychiatry and changing the way of thinking about diagnostic schemes and so forth. I wonder, and I think it would be very important for your book to be a living document that will get revised again and again with the times. Perhaps lives in the cyber world for people to kind of just log in and look it up in some way, and that's my hope.
Well, I'm working on that. There will be another edition, but I just want to say, Dr. Keshavan is the editor of Schizophrenia Research, and I hope you can be reassured that a person with his values is the king of this journal, Schizophrenia Research. I am very reassured by that, because you get why we need a better brain-based science because of all the shame and discrimination people have faced. So I want to thank you for that. How are we doing, Bonnie, on time?
We can do one more.
One more?
Yeah.
Let's bring it home.
Or should we?
Anywhere you like.
Come on, we can move on.
Hi. Part of why I'm so drawn to this book is the idea that it centers humanity, right? It has these personal elements and stories. And I think I'm going to kind of preface my question with a very quick story, I promise, actually about Ken. There's a moment years ago, you were on a panel. Ken used to work with my mom at VinFem, and they ran this film festival every year. And Ken was sitting on a panel after a movie with some very dark themes about people taking advantage of those who are mentally ill, and the panel discussion afterwards started to kind of meander to a very dark place, talking about the kind of unethical treatment and the ways that some providers or people can perpetuate pain. And Ken paused, and when it was kind of his turn to speak, said something that completely transformed the way that I relate not only to pain, but to problem solving. He said, this is an important storyline, not to minimize, but we have to remember that this is not the real focus here. The focus here is that people get better, that it works when you have love and when you have care and when you have these tools. And I think about that all the time. It completely transformed the way I look at problem solving. And I think I would love to hear from any of you who would like to share, if you have a moment like that, that kind of switch, or a quote or a mantra that helps reframe the inevitable challenges that are part of this conversation.
Thank you, Gemma. I don't remember that at all, but it's believable. I don't remember that at all. It sounds like an average panel, right? Anybody want to comment on Gemma's question? Like a different way of framing your experience. Like, was there a moment that happened, or?
I think what's strange is that the moment is happening to me now. I was in the car with Ken on the drive over here, and we were talking about all of the things I've lost since being in remission from bipolar disorder, which is my ability to paint, my ability to creatively write, my stand-up comedy. But as I was sitting here listening to everyone on the panel, I realized that like I can do things now that are normal and they're wonderful, like read a book. Like I couldn't do that with my scattered bipolar brain before, and now I can sit through like 462 pages, I think.
Lots of pictures though, lots of.
And it's a gift. It's like breathing fresh air, and people do get better. And there are other things that I have to contend with now. My drugs have been really hard on my body, on my kidneys. I have diabetes now, I have high cholesterol now, I've gained 70 pounds. There's like a lot of things that I'm waking up to and suddenly have to navigate, but I can do them now, and I do them with that doctor that I mentioned earlier, and things seem better and brighter, and I'm in love, and it's just a lot of gratitude that I feel.
You know, as a sibling, I would give a similar answer, that it's this experience in moments like this where you come forth and you talk openly about what's happening, that you know, the light of day, the sunshine is just such a great balm to the soul. And by the way, if I can take a moment to tell you what helped my sister get better, I think a lot of families might enjoy this. So there were two things that helped my sister get better. One was that she was living at home. She was refusing medicine. She was very irritable. And my mother gave an ultimatum. Not an empty ultimatum just to pressure her. She really meant it. You have to take your medicine if you want to live at home. So Janet took her medicine. And the second thing that happened was love. She married the most wonderful man, and they, like, much like what you're describing, what you're describing about connecting with other people is that they got involved in so many self-help organizations. And although he unfortunately died young of heart failure, his legacy lives on. And together they built what I call a pay-it-forward community on steroids. They really put a lot of energy into it, but it really, people get better.
Nancy, you want to comment?
I was somewhere else. I just want to say my favorite question that you gave us was, what does recovery mean for you, for me? And the word I came up with was self-love. I mean, just learning how to love yourself. So I'm sorry if that doesn't relate to what you were saying, but that's really what it's about. And giving this opportunity to speak to people is just, I'm available 24/7. Let me in on your world, and I'll be happy to share. And I think that's where it's got to go forward this way. We have to be able to be courageous and share our stories. So
I've already had people say, can I talk to Stephen Smith in Texas? I have OCD and I haven't been able to figure my way out of it. So you may be contacted as experts. I'm going to close because this is a home game. This is Boston. This is Brookline. So I wrote in my essay as a naive 26-year-old kid. My dad had bipolar disorder. I want to become a psychiatrist to help him. I went to every program in America: University of California, San Diego, Stanford, UCSF, University of Colorado, Temple Med, University of Pennsylvania. Everybody ignored my essay. We couldn't talk about it. We couldn't talk about it. The only reason I went, I had no interest in medicine, science, or calculus. I can't emphasize. I was like a history baseball boy. College football. When I moved to the Midwest, I go college football, polite driving, public education, and Marty. That's what I got out of Michigan. Like, we moved to Michigan. So I write this essay. Everybody ignores the essay. Nobody says anything about it. I go to a world famous institution not far from here in Belmont, Massachusetts. And I'm spoken to by a world famous person who says it's a terrible reason to become a psychiatrist. And I said, what would be a good reason? And he paused for a long time. I don't think many people asked him questions. I think, I was like, who's this young little nobody? Because I was a total nobody. And he said, I think if your father was a psychiatrist, that's a good reason. So I'm a free lunch guy. I left the world famous facility in Belmont. I passed the free lunch because I remember thinking, I'm too upset to steal 2 sandwiches, which would be baseline Ken behavior. Free food, let's go. I get into the car and I burst into tears and I realize this whole thing isn't going to work. I got to go to cardiology. I like cardiology. Simple, pipes, tubes, you stick stuff in, you fix stuff, you drive BMWs. Like, that has a, you talk to people about their hearts, that's not mental health, but it's important. And then the moment I had the next day, I'd already given up on psychiatry. I had one last interview at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, and Ned, who asked that question, read my essay and said, this is such an advantage. This is such an advantage. You know what it's like. I moved to Boston to work at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, where I'm going to die on the faculty of the Massachusetts Mental Health Center because one person said, hey, that could be an advantage. That's all he had to say. He couldn't have imagined I would write this book or work for NAMI. He gave me permission to be myself. And so, Jim, that's my moment that's similar to this. All I needed was one person. It's a half an hour conversation. It changed my life. I'm like, I'm moving here, right here. Brookline, Boston, Massachusetts Mental Health Center. I live in Roslindale Square. All because Ned said, this could be a good thing. And the rest is history, really. And that's, the book is based on that. All the people I got to meet here, that this is my favorite bookstore. So thank you, Ned, you are here. And that was my little moment with one person. That was incredible when you affirm one person. So I want to encourage you, when we're going to sign books, get them to sign your book. Because we're all experts in the book. And this is the only time the Brookline Booksmith All-Stars will be assembled. Right? The next time we'll be in Denver, it'll be different people. The next time we'll be in Seattle, different people. There's 4 different events in Los Angeles, all different people. So this is the only time this constellation of lived experience experts can sign your book. So I highly encourage that. All right, I want to thank Sukhmani, Cynthia, Nancy-Lee. And thank you all for coming. This is really very special.